What have you learned? Both of you, actually, you both are close with Gary Keller. What have you learned being in his proximity over the last several decades of your life?
The gift of working with him is this idea that we can always think bigger. That's his superpower.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah.
He's always thinking bigger for the people he cares about than they have thought themselves, and he can make you see it.
Yeah.
And that's been a real constant gift. Like every time we think we're thinking big, he'll remind us that we could still think bigger, ask bigger questions of ourselves and our life.
Yeah.
And I like to grow. So it's a little bit unrelenting, and there are days where I feel like he's shaking the tree and I'm ready just to fall off. Yeah. But it also makes you strong, and I'm super appreciative of that part of the journey.
Yeah, very cool.
Well, and I think also this idea of coming from contribution, which is for me always been teaching and podcasting and really giving back. And that can change your life. The best way to learn is definitely to teach.
Yeah.
And so, Gary shared that with me early on, and I just took that to heart. And I teach all the time. I teach in my real estate office. I teach my team. I'm podcasting. And that's how I've grown.
Yeah. It definitely makes you better when you teach somebody else.
Yeah.
In fact, I once heard a study, and I don't remember where I read it, and maybe it's fake, but the idea was people always say how do you retain the best, you remember, 10% of what you read and 20% of what you this, and people often say, oh, you remember most of what you teach, but then some study said it's not necessarily what you teach, it's what you think you have to teach. And so when I read a book, whenever the underlining thing, I always tell myself, I'm gonna have to teach this later. Mm-hmm. And I convince myself, because I probably will have to teach it at some point, but if I'm reading with a pen and assume I have to then teach it, that's when you really solidify that information. And
I love it. You're reading not just to understand it, but to help other people understand it.
So if you read with the frame and the mindset that I will have to help somebody else figure this out later. So I'll even tell myself, I got to tell Heather this. Even though I know I probably won't, I might tell her 2% of what I think I'm going to tell her later in terms of book reading. But I just think, I got to tell this to Heather later. Or I got to make a video about this for Instagram. Yep. And then I instantly, you retain. And so, when people, I tend to remember hundreds of books that I've read, and that's how I think I can do it is, and probably you as well, because you both are teachers.
Yeah.
And so you remember what you read because of that. Let's completely shift gears.
Okay.
What do you love about each other? Who wants to go first? What do you love most?
The thing that drives me crazy. She's an extrovert, right? So she pushes me to be uncomfortable, whereas I would love to be in my cave with a book or watching a movie. My favorite date night is sitting in a dark theater holding her hand, but we don't actually have to talk.
Yeah.
But that I know, because I want to stay married, that we get to do other things too. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, is that it's not the parts where we've been very alike and we have the amazing, we both want to be entrepreneurial, we both like to give, we both like to teach, we both like to read, we both all of that's great. It's the part where we're ultimately opposite.
Yeah.
You live long enough with that and you realize it's actually really good for you.
Yeah.
My good looks.
Obviously, your six-pack abs. Well, for me, the thing that always drew me to Jay was he's incredibly curious. He has an insatiable mind for interesting information. And I'm just someone who I kind of think most people are boring. And Jay has always been very, very interesting. And just from listening to him, you can tell how smart he is and how much he studies. And sometimes I feel like I learn more at breakfast, than most people do in a lifetime. So I'm lucky that way.
Collecting those dots.
What about your kids? What do you love about each of your kids?
With one of our children in the room.
Well, I will say with Gus, who's here, he's incredibly kind and empathetic. So there's 3 of us in the family, and we're all kind of like the drivers who don't have as much empathy. And so whether he was born that way or he kind of ended up that way, he's almost like the glue that holds our family together with his empathy and kindness. And then both of my kids are incredibly creative. I have so many memories of them as kids. They did this thing where they called it the game, where they basically acted out like a story together. And they're both incredible writers, very deep thinkers, gifted artistically. Our youngest is gifted artistically, drawing, and so they're both really creative. Which, I living in the business world, you understand how the world actually needs a lot more creativity and less business.
Yes, so much more.
Yeah.
I just read a book called Simplicity Parenting by a guy named John Kim Payne, I think it is. And it was written like before the iPhone was invented, but like around that time. But it talked a lot about screen time even before that was a problem. Like he kind of foresee the problem. But he made this really interesting point in there about kids that are put into sports too early. Organized sports, baseball, whatever, at like 5, 6, 7 years old. They learn to operate in rules. Versus creatively. And so he talks a lot about like not putting kids in sports too early so you can develop that piece of their mind, because once you skip that part of their life and put them into this is how the world works, these are the rules, this is your role, don't learn other roles like we learn in sports, you don't get that back.
Well, and that was one of the reasons we put our kids in kind of an alternative education environment, because a lot of that creativity was being squeezed out of them at the public school that they were at, and it was a great public school. But they would come home and it was like their love of learning was getting squeezed out of them. And as someone who is a lifelong learner and desires to be a lifelong learner for my life, the rest of my life, it just made me really sad to see that. And
Edward was like reading 800-page books at home by himself, but could not be assigned more difficult reading in class until he was formally in the honors program. And we're like, really? He has to read like Matilda when he's reading this giant novel. And it was like, they didn't, it's not that there was anything wrong. It was a blue ribbon school. But if you've got an edge case, they were very rules based around the edges. And that doesn't serve every child equally.